In Russian Orthodox Church history, the Old Believers, or Old Ritualists, separated after 1666 from the official Russian Orthodox Church as a protest against church reforms introduced by Patriarch Nikon of Moscow between 1652 and 1666. Old Believers continue liturgical practices that the Russian Orthodox Church maintained before the implementation of these reforms. Russian speakers refer to the schism itself as raskol, etymologically indicating a cleaving-apart. Introductory summary of origins. In 1652, Patriarch Nikon introduced a number of ritual and textual revisions with the aim of achieving uniformity between the practices of the Russian and Greek Orthodox churches. Nikon, having noticed discrepancies between Russian and Greek rites and texts, ordered an adjustment of the Russian rites to align with the Greek ones of his time. In doing so, according to the Old Believers, Nikon acted without adequate consultation with the clergy and without gathering a council. After the implementation of these revisions, the Church anathematized and suppressed, with the support of Muscovite state power, the prior liturgical rite itself, as well as those who were reluctant to pass to the revised rite. Those who maintained fidelity to the existing rite endured severe persecutions from the end of the 17th century until the beginning of the 20th century as schismatics. They became known as Old Ritualists, a name introduced during the reign of Catherine the Great. They continued to call themselves simply Orthodox Christians. Reforms of Patriarch Nikon. By the middle of the 17th century, Greek and Russian church officials, including Patriarch Nikon of Moscow, had noticed discrepancies between contemporary Russian and Greek usages. They reached the conclusion that the Russian Orthodox Church had, as a result of errors of incompetent copyists, developed rites and liturgical books of its own that had significantly deviated from the Greek originals. Thus, the Russian Orthodox Church had become dissonant from the other Orthodox churches. Later research was to vindicate the Muscovite service books as belonging to a different Greek recension from that which was used by the Greeks at the time of Nikon, and the unrevised Muscovite books were actually older than the current Greek books, which had undergone several revisions over the centuries and ironically were newer and contained innovations. Nikon wanted to have the same rite in the Russian Tsardom and in majority ethnic Slavic lands then part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to attract local Orthodox rebels, whose rite was closer to the Greek than that in the Moscow Duchy, as Nikon did not want to adopt two different rites in the same church. Nikon, supported by Tsar Alexis, carried out some preliminary liturgical reforms. In 1652, he convened a synod and exhorted the clergy on the need to compare Russian Typikon, Euchologion, and other liturgical books with their Greek counterparts. Monasteries from all over Russia received requests to send examples to Moscow in order to have them subjected to a comparative analysis. Such a task would have taken many years of conscientious research and could hardly have given an unambiguous result, given the complex development of the Russian liturgical texts over the previous centuries and the lack of textual historiographic techniques at the time. The locum tenens for Patriarch Petrim of Moscow convened the 1666 Great Moscow Synod, which brought Patriarch Makarios III of Antioch, Patriarch Bysius of Alexandria and many bishops to Moscow. Some scholars allege that the visiting patriarchs each received both 20,000 rubles in gold and furs for their participation. This council officially established the reforms and anathematized not only all those opposing the innovations, but the old Russian books and rites themselves as well, as a side effect of condemning the past of the Russian Orthodox Church and her traditions. The Messianic theory depicting Moscow as the Third Rome appeared weaker. Instead of the guardian of Orthodox faith, Moscow seemed an accumulation of serious liturgical mistakes. Nevertheless, both Patriarch and Tsar wished to carry out the reforms, although their endeavors may have had as much a more political motivation as religious. Several authors on this subject point out that Tsar Alexis, encouraged by his military success in the Russo-Polish War to conquer West Russian provinces and Ukraine, developed ambitions of becoming the liberator of the Orthodox areas which at the time formed part of the Ottoman Empire. They also mention the role of the Near East patriarchs, who actively supported the idea of the Russian Tsar becoming the liberator of all Orthodox Christians and who suggested that Patriarch Nikon might become the new Patriarch of Constantinople. Main alterations introduced by Patriarch Nikon. The numerous changes in both texts and rites occupied approximately 400 pages. Old believers present the following as the most crucial changes. Today's readers might perceive these alterations as trivial, but the faithful of that time saw rituals and dogmas as strongly interconnected. Church rituals had from the very beginning represented and symbolized doctrinal truth. Furthermore, the authorities imposed the reforms in an autocratic fashion, with no consultation of the people who would become subject to them, and those who reacted against the Nikonian reforms would have objected as much to the manner of imposition as to the actual alterations. In addition, changes often occurred arbitrarily in the texts. For example, wherever the books read, Nikon's assistants substituted, and wherever they read, they substituted. Another example is that wherever the books read, Nikon substituted, and vice versa. According to a sympathetic source, the incorrectly realized book revision by Nikon, owing to its speed, its range, its foreignness of sources and its offending character, was bound to provoke protest, given the seriously assimilated, not only national, but also genuine Orthodox identity of the Russian people. The protest was indeed global. The episcopate, the clergy, both regular and monastic, the laity and the ordinary people. Schism. Opponents of the ecclesiastical reforms of Nikon emerged among all strata of the people and in relatively large numbers. However, after the deposition of Patriarch Nikon, who presented too strong a challenge to the Tsar's authority, a series of church councils officially endorsed Nikon's liturgical reforms. The old believers fiercely rejected all innovations, and the most radical amongst them maintained that the official church had fallen into the hands of the Antichrist, under the guidance of Archpriest Avakam Petrov, who had become the leader of the Old Believers movement. The Old Believers publicly denounced and rejected all ecclesiastical reforms. The state church anathematized both the old rites and books and those who wished to stay loyal to them at the Synod of 1666. For that moment, the Old Believers officially lacked all civil rights. The state had the most active Old Believers arrested, and executed several of them some years later in 1682. After the schism, after 1685, a period of persecutions began, including both torture and executions. Many Old Believers fled Russia altogether, particularly for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where the community exists to this day. Old Believers became the dominant denomination in many regions, including the Pomors of the Russian far north, in the Kursk region, in the Ural Mountains, in Siberia, Siberia and in the Russian Far East. The 40,000-strong community of Lipovans still lives in neighboring Kilya Raion of Ukraine and Tulchaya County of Romania in the Danube Delta. By the 1910s, in the last Imperial Russian census just before the October Revolution, approximately 10% of the population of the Russian Empire said that they belonged to one of the Old Believer branches. Government oppression could vary from relatively moderate, as under Peter the Great, to intense, as under Tsar Nicholas I. The Russian synodal state church and the state authorities often saw Old Believers as dangerous elements and as a threat to the Russian state. In 1905, Tsar Nicholas II signed an act of religious freedom that ended the persecution of all religious minorities in Russia. The Old Believers gained the right to build churches, to ring church bells, to hold processions and to organize themselves. It became prohibited to refer to Old Believers as raskolniki, a name they consider insulting. People often refer to the period from 1905 until 1917 as the Golden Age of the Old Faith. One can regard the Act of 1905 as emancipating the Old Believers, who had until then occupied an almost illegal position in Russian society. Nevertheless, some restrictions for Old Believers continued. For example, they were forbidden from joining the civil service. Old Believer Denominations. Although all Old Believers groups emerged as a result of opposition to the Nikonian reform, they do not constitute a single monolithic body. Despite the emphasis on invariable adherence to the pre-Nikonian traditions, the Old Believers feature a great diversity of groups that profess different interpretations of the church tradition and often are not in communion with each other. Since none of the bishops joined the Old Believers, apostolically ordained priests of the Old Rite would have soon become extinct. Two responses appeared to this dilemma: the Popovtsi and the Bezpopovtsi. Popovtsi. The Popovtsi represented the more moderate conservative opposition, those who strove to continue religious and church life as it had existed before the reforms of Nikon. They recognized ordained priests from the new-style Russian Orthodox Church who joined the Old Believers and who had denounced the Nikonian reforms. In 1846, they convinced Ambrose of Belaya, a Greek Orthodox bishop whom Turkish pressure had removed from his see at Sarajevo, to become an Old Believer and to consecrate 3 Russian Old Believer priests as bishops. In 1859, the number of Old Believer bishops in Russia reached 10 and they established their own episcopate, the Belokrinitskaya hierarchy. Not all Popovtsi Old Believers recognized this hierarchy. Dissenters known as Beglo-Popovtsi obtained their own hierarchy in the 1920s. The priestist Old Believers thus manifest as 2 churches which share the same beliefs, but which treat each other's hierarchy as illegitimate. Popovtsi have priests, bishops and all sacraments, including the Eucharist. Belokrinitskaya hierarchy, the largest Popovtsi denomination. One can refer to the Russian part of this denomination as the Belokrinitskoye Soglasi or as the Russian Orthodox Old Rite Church. Neo-Krushniki, Novozybkovskaya hierarchy, a Russian Old Orthodox Church. Beglo-Popovtsi, Luzkane, also known as Luzkovskoye Soglasi. In some places they had no priests and so belonged to the Bezpopovtsi. Bezpopovtsi. The Bezpopovtsi rejected the world where they believed the Antichrist reigned. They preached the imminent end of the world, of asceticism, adherence to the old rituals and the old faith. more radical movements which already existed prior to the reforms of Nikon, and where eschatological and anti-clerical sentiments were predominant, would join the Bezpopovtsi Old Believers. The Bezpopovtsi claimed that any priest or ordinary who has ever used the Nikonian rites have forfeited apostolic succession. Therefore, the true Church of Christ had ceased to exist on earth, and they therefore renounced priests and all sacraments except baptism. The Bezpopovtsi movement has many subgroups. This Popovtsi have no priests and no Eucharist. Pomorian Old Orthodox Church Danilov originated in North Russia. Initially they rejected marriage and prayer for the Tsar. Novopomortsi or New Pomortsi accept marriage. Staropomortsi or Old Pomortsi reject marriage. Fedosivti, Society of Christian Old Believers of the Old Pomortsi unmarried confession, deny marriage and practice cloister-style asceticism. Philippians, named after the founder, Philip. They were repressed by the Russian government, and so, the Filipovti started practicing self-immolation as a means for the preservation of the faith. Chasiveni, a Siberian branch. The Chasiveni initially had priests, but later decided to change to a priestless practice, also known as Semiski. Bezpopovtsi, minor groups. Apart from these major groups, many smaller groups have emerged and became extinct at various times since the end of the 17th century. Aristovti, for the name of the merchant Aristov. Titlovsti, emerged from Fedosivti, supported the use of the inscription ISNI upon the Orthodox cross, which other groups rejected. Troparian confession, a group that commemorated the Tsar in the hymns. Daniel's confession of the partially married. Adamant confession, refused to use money and passports. Aaron's confession, second half of the 18th century, a spin-off of the Filipovti. Grandmother's confession, or the self-baptized, practice self-baptism of the baptism by midwives, since a valid priesthood, in their opinion, had ceased to exist. Hole worshippers relinquished the use of icons and prayed to the east through a hole in the wall. Melchizedek's practiced a peculiar lay, quasi-Eucharistic rite. Runaways or wanderers. Netovti, or Saviour's confession, denied the possibility of celebrating sacraments and praying in churches. The name comes from the Russian netno, since they have no sacraments, no churches, no priests, etc. Edanovotsi agreed to become a part of the official Russian Orthodox Church while saving the old rites. First appearing in 1800, the Edanovotsi come under the Omophorion of the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, abbreviated as ROCOR, have come into communion under different circumstances and retain being old believers in the traditional context and retain the use of the pre-Nikonian rituals. They can be regarded as Old Ritualists, but they do not count as Old Believers in the traditional context. Background. As Sergei Zankowski points out in his standard work Russia's Old Believers, the Old Believer schism did not occur simply as a result of a few individuals with power and influence. The schism had complex causes, revealing historical processes and circumstances in 17th century Russian society. Those who broke from the hierarchy of the official state church had quite divergent views on church, faith, society, state power and social issues. Thus the collective term Old Believers groups together various movements within Russian society which actually had existed long before 1666 to 67. They shared a distrust of state power and of the episcopate. pulpit, insisting upon the right of the people to arrange their own spiritual life, and expressing the ambition to aim for such control. Both the Popovtsy and Bispopovtsy, although theologically and psychologically two different teachings, manifested spiritual, eschatological and mystical tendencies throughout Russian religious thought and church life. One can also emphasize the schism's position in the political and cultural background of its time. Increasing Western influence, secularization, and attempts to subordinate the Church to the state. Nevertheless, the Old Believers sought above all to defend and preserve the purity of the Orthodox faith, embodied in the Old Rituals, which inspired many to strive against Patriarch Nikon's church reforms even unto death. In the past, the Old Believers movement was often perceived as an obscure faith in rituals that led to the deaths of tens of thousands of ignorant people. Old Believers were accused of not being able to distinguish the important from the unimportant. To many people of the time, however, rituals expressed the very essence of the faith. Old Believers hold that the preservation of a certain microclimate that enables the salvation of one's soul requires not only living by the commandments of Christ, but also carefully preserving church tradition, which contains the spiritual power and knowledge of past centuries, embodied in external forms. The Old Believers reject the idea of contents a priori prevailing over form. To illustrate this issue, the renowned Russian historian Vasily Klyachevsky referred to poetry. He argued that if one converts a poem into prose, the contents of the poem may remain intact, but the poem will lose its charm and emotional impact. Moreover, the poem will essentially no longer exist. In the case of religious rituals, form and contents do not just form two separable, autonomous entities, but connect with each other through complex relationships, including theological, psychological, phenomenal, aesthetic and historic dimensions. These aspects, in turn, play a role in the perception of these rituals by the faithful and in the spiritual lives. Considering the fact that church rituals from the very beginning were intertwined with doctrinal truth, changing these rituals may have a tremendous effect on religious conscience and a severe impact on the faithful. Nevertheless, centuries of persecution and the nature of their origin have made some Old Believers culturally conservative. Some Old Believers consider any pre-Nikonian Orthodox Russian practice or artifact as exclusively theirs, denying that the Russian Orthodox Church has any claims upon a history before Patriarch Nikon. However, Russian economic history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveals the Old Believer merchant families as more flexible and more open to innovations while creating factories and starting the first Russian industries. Main differences between the Old Believers and post-Nikonian Russian Orthodoxy. Old Believers use two fingers while making the sign of the cross, while New Style Orthodoxy uses three fingers for the sign of cross held together at point, two fingers folded. Old Ritualists generally say the Jesus prayer with the sign of the cross, while New Ritualists use the sign of the cross as a Trinitarian symbol. This makes for a significant difference between the two branches of Russian Orthodoxy, and one of the most noticeable. Old Believers reject any changes and emendations of liturgical texts and rituals introduced by the reforms of Patriarch Nikon. Thus they continue to use the previous Church Slavonic translation of the Greek texts, including the Psalter, striving to preserve intact the pre-Nikonian practices of the Russian Church. Old Believers only recognize performing baptism through three full immersions, in agreement with the Greek practice, but reject the validity of any baptismal rite performed otherwise. Old Believers perform the liturgy with 7 prosphra instead of 5 as in New Rite Russian Orthodoxy, or a single large prosphoron, as sometimes done by the Greeks and Arabs. Old Believers chant the Alleluia verse after the psalmody 2 times rather than the 3 used in the Nikonian reforms. Old Believers do not use polyphonic singing as the new style Russian practice, but only monodic unison singing. They also have their own musical notation, not with linear notation, but with special signs, kryuki as in Amina. Old Believers practice several different types of znameni chant: Stolpov chant, Great Znameni chant, Lesy Znameni chant, Putovoy chant, Pomorsky chant, Domestveni chant, etc. In this respect it represents a tradition that parallels the use of Byzantine chant and pneumatic notation. Present situation. In 1971 the Moscow Patriarchate revoked the anathemas imposed on the Old Believers in the 17th century. In 1974, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia issued a new kasha revoking the anathemas and asked forgiveness from the Old Believers for the wrongs done to them. Under their auspices, the first efforts to make the prayer and service books of the Old Believers available in English were made. Nevertheless, most Old Believer communities have not returned to communion with the majority of Orthodox Christianity worldwide. Estimates place the total number of Old Believers remaining as of 2006 at from 1 to 2 million. Some living in extremely isolated communities in places to which they fled centuries ago to avoid persecution. One Old Believer parish in the United States, in Erie, Pennsylvania, has entered into communion with the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, after a split in the congregation. The remainder have continued as Old Believers. Old Believer churches in Russia currently have started restoration of the property, although Old Believers face many difficulties in claiming the restitution rights for the churches. Moscow has churches for all the most important Old Believer branches. Rogovskaya Zastava, a cathedral for the Novozybkovskaya hierarchy in Zamoskvorечье and Preobrazhenskaya Zastava, where Pomortsy and Fedosivty coexist. Within the Old Believer world, only Pomortsy and Fedosivty treat each other relatively well. None of the other denominations acknowledge each other. Ordinary Old Believers display some tendencies of interbranch ecumenism, but these trends find sparse support among the official leaders of the congregations. Modern-day Old Believers live all over the world, having fled Russia under Tsarist persecution and after the Russian Revolution of 1917. Some Old Believers are still transient throughout various parts of the world today. Significant established Old Believer communities exist in the United States and Canada in Plamunden, Alberta, Woodburn, Oregon, Erie, Pennsylvania, Erskine, Minnesota, and in various parts of Alaska, including near Homer in the Fox River area villages of Voznesenka, Razdolna, and Karkamak Selo, Nikolisk, Berioza Uka, Delta Junction, and Kodiak, Alaska. Two flourishing communities also exist in Sydney, Australia, and in the South Island of New Zealand. Communities also have been established in many parts of South America, including Brazil, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Argentina. Small hidden communities have been found in the Russian far north and various regions of Siberia, especially concentrated in the areas between the Altai Mountains and Tuva Republic. Perhaps the highest concentration of older established Old Believer communities, with foundations dating back hundreds of years, can be found concentrated in eastern Siberia, specifically the Transbaikal region in desolate areas of Buryatia and Zabaykalsky Krai. Others, like the Lykov family, fled later into the wild to avoid communist persecution. The Lipovans, who live in Romania's Danube Delta, are descendants of the Old Believers who left Russia in around 1740 to avoid religious persecutions. Conservative Old Believer population stands at some 3,000 in Bolivia, while that in Alaska is estimated at 2,500. In Estonia, there are 2,605 Old Believers according to 2011 census. They live mostly in villages from Moskva to Omidu and from Nina to Varna on the western coast of Lake Peipus, and on Pearisar Island. Old Believer churches: Lipovan Orthodox Old Rite Church, Lipovans; Pomorian Old Orthodox Church; Russian Old Orthodox Church; Russian Orthodox Old Rite Church. Union of Old Believer parishes in Estonia.